The first time I realized something was wrong in Hartford wasn't after the accusations started. It was when people began locking their doors before sunset because they claimed someone was whispering their names outside the windows after dark. You're listening to True Haunting Log, where we share real haunted incidents from real people around the globe. And if you've experienced something you can't explain, send your story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com. Story 1. The town that started hearing things. This happened in Hartford, Connecticut during the witch panic years, back when entire settlements could collapse under fear faster than disease itself. I worked night watch for part of the town then, mostly walking patrol routes near the church grounds and outer homes while families slept. At least, that's what they pretended to do. Truthfully, very few people slept peacefully anymore once the accusations began spreading through Hartford. Before the panic fully took hold, the town already felt strained. Winters had been harsh, sickness moved unpredictably between homes, livestock failed without clear explanation, and people were desperate for certainty in a world where death often arrived without warning. That desperation changed the atmosphere slowly at first. Conversations became quieter. Neighbors stopped trusting one another fully. Church sermons grew harsher after sunset. Then the accusations began. At first, they sounded ridiculous even by Colonial standards. One woman claimed she saw someone standing outside her home at midnight despite the person supposedly being miles away asleep. Another swore a voice whispered prayers backward outside her bedroom wall. Children began waking, screaming about figures watching them through windows from the tree line. And because fear spreads faster than reason in isolated places, every story fed the next one until the entire town started expecting something terrible to appear after dark. I remember the first execution clearly because afterward the town didn't calm down the way people expected. It became worse, much worse. Instead of relief, Hartford developed a strange silence after sunset that hadn't existed before. Homes stayed dark earlier. Families stopped traveling between properties at night. And during patrols, I started noticing something unsettling near the church road after midnight. Footsteps. Not random movement. Consistent footsteps following behind me at a distance whenever I crossed certain sections of town. At first, I assumed another watchman was patrolling nearby, but every time I stopped walking, the second set of footsteps stopped too. And whenever I turned with my lantern raised, the roads behind me remained empty except for fog drifting between homes. One night near the outer edge of town, I tested it deliberately. I stopped near a fence line and waited without moving while cold wind pushed through the trees surrounding the settlement. Silence settled for several seconds. Then, one final footstep sounded behind me after I had already stopped. My chest tightened immediately. I turned fast enough to spill lantern oil across my hand, but the road behind me remained empty. No movement, no figure, nothing except darkness stretching toward the church grounds further down the path. Then I heard whispering, very soft, coming from somewhere near the houses behind me. At first I couldn't understand the words clearly because the sound drifted strangely through the wind, but slowly, one sentence became recognizable. They're listening now. I remember gripping the lantern tighter while scanning the empty road because the voice sounded close enough to belong to someone standing nearby, yet no person appeared anywhere in sight. Then another whisper answered from a different direction, further down the road. Who will they blame next? My pulse started climbing fast after that because I recognized both voices. They belonged to women already executed weeks earlier. Hearing the voices of women already executed changed something inside me immediately because, until that moment, I had still been trying to explain the panic logically. Fear, isolation, religious hysteria. But standing alone on that dark Hartford road listening to dead voices whisper through the fog made the town suddenly feel infected by something much worse than rumor. I remember backing slowly away from the church road with the lantern raised higher while the whispering drifted between the houses around me. The voices never shouted. That was part of what made them terrifying. They sounded patient, calm, like people holding quiet conversations just outside visibility. Then another voice whispered from somewhere near the church fence beside me, "They'll hear you too soon." I turned sharply toward the sound and caught movement between the fog-covered graves near the churchyard. A woman standing partially behind one of the fence posts watching the road. Pale dress. Motionless posture. The lantern light shook slightly in my hand because even from a distance I recognized her face. She had been executed only 10 days earlier. The figure didn't approach me, didn't threaten me. She simply stood there looking toward the town itself with an expression that felt deeply wrong, not angry, exhausted, like someone watching something terrible repeat itself over and over again. "Who's there?" I called out despite already knowing the answer. The woman slowly turned her head toward me. "Still listening?" she whispered. Then the fog shifted across the churchyard and she disappeared completely behind it. I spent the rest of that patrol avoiding the church road entirely, not because I believed the dead were truly walking Hartford, but because I had begun understanding something more dangerous. The fear spreading through town had reached a point where everyone expected to hear things now, and once people begin expecting terror badly enough, every sound in darkness starts becoming proof. Over the following weeks, the panic intensified across Hartford in ways difficult to describe unless you've watched paranoia consume an entire community firsthand. Families stopped eating together after dark because accusations had begun forming inside homes themselves. Children claimed voices, whispered names outside bedroom windows at night. One farmer swore something knocked on his door 3 times every midnight before vanishing when he checked outside, and nearly everyone in town started hearing footsteps after sunset. The strange part was how similar the stories became. People described hearing movement pacing outside homes before dawn. Others reported whispers, repeating private conversations nobody else should have known. One elderly woman became convinced someone was standing beside her bed every night shortly before sunrise, breathing softly in the darkness. I tried keeping myself grounded by focusing on work, but Hartford itself no longer felt normal after dark. The town had become unnaturally quiet. No laughter. No conversation drifting between homes. Just locked doors and candlelight hidden behind shuttered windows while everyone listened for sounds outside. Then, the accusations started spreading faster again. Another woman arrested. Then, another. The church sermons became harsher afterward, ministers warning openly that evil had rooted itself inside Hartford, and the more executions occurred, the worse the nightly disturbances seemed to become. One evening after patrol, I stopped briefly outside a home near the edge of town where a family had recently accused their own neighbor of witchcraft. As I passed the house, I heard crying inside, followed by a man shouting prayers loudly enough to echo into the street. Then suddenly, all noise stopped. A few seconds later, someone whispered my name from directly behind me. I spun around instantly, lantern raised, but nobody stood there. The empty road stretched silently toward the woods outside Hartford while fog rolled slowly between the homes. Then, the whisper came again, closer now. "You hear us because you're afraid, too." My breathing tightened painfully because the voice sounded familiar in a different way this time. Not like someone executed, like someone living, someone from town. Then, from somewhere inside the nearby houses, another whisper answered softly through the darkness. "He's beginning to listen." After the voices said I was beginning to listen, the fear inside Hartford stopped feeling external to me. Until then, I had still believed I was observing the panic from a distance, like someone standing outside a storm, but slowly I realized the town changes everyone living inside it eventually. The constant accusations, the sleepless nights, the silence after dark, all of it begins reshaping the way people hear ordinary sounds. I started noticing it during patrols first. Every creaking branch sounded deliberate. Every voice drifting through the fog made my chest tighten immediately. And worst of all, I began hearing whispers even when the streets were empty, sometimes near the churchyard, sometimes outside homes where accusations had recently spread. Always soft, always calm. One night, I stopped outside the jail holding several accused townspeople before trial. The building sat near the edge of Hartford, away from most homes, and after midnight, the road leading there felt isolated enough to belong to another town entirely. I remember hearing quiet praying from inside one of the cells as I approached. Then another voice answered from somewhere inside the darkness behind the building. They prayed too. I froze immediately because the whisper sounded close enough to belong to someone standing only feet away, but when I raised the lantern toward the rear of the jail, the narrow path behind it remained empty. Then something moved near the far corner of the structure, a woman stepping slowly into view from the darkness. Pale face, dark clothing, bare feet in the mud. She looked alive. That was the worst part. Not ghostly, not transparent, just exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "You shouldn't stay outside after midnight anymore," she said quietly. I recognized her instantly. She had been accused 3 days earlier and locked inside the jail behind me. My pulse tightened violently because I knew she couldn't possibly be standing outside while imprisoned inside at the same time. "Who are you?" I asked, though part of me already understood. The woman looked toward the jail windows without answering immediately. "They hear things before they accuse you," she whispered. "That's how it begins." The praying inside the jail suddenly stopped after she said that. Complete silence followed. Then slowly, knocking began from inside one of the cells. 3 calm knocks against the wood. The woman outside smiled faintly after hearing them. Not happily, sadly. "Now they're listening too," she said. I stepped backward instinctively, and the moment I did, the figure near the jail corner disappeared into the darkness beyond the building. Not running, just gone between one breath and the next. Then the knocking inside the jail spread to another cell, then another. Calm, evenly spaced. Soon the entire structure echoed with soft knocking from different rooms, while voices inside began praying louder in panic. I remember backing away from the jail road completely after that because, for the first time, I truly understood how dangerous Hartford had become. The town no longer needed real hauntings anymore. Fear itself was now creating them. Every accusation infected more people psychologically until the entire settlement began hearing the same things. But the worst realization came later that week, during a church gathering after another execution. The minister stood before the town warning that evil still moved through Hartford despite previous punishments, and while people listened silently beside candlelight and fog-covered graves, I noticed something horrifying. Nobody looked relieved after executions anymore. They looked expectant. Like part of them was already waiting for the next voice outside the window, the next whisper, after dark, the next person fear would choose. Then during the middle of the sermon, a woman near the back of the church suddenly stood up, shaking violently, and pointed toward the rear doors. "They're outside again," she whispered. Every person in the church turned at once. And from beyond the closed wooden doors came slow footsteps circling the building. The footsteps outside the church moved slowly through the mud surrounding the building, while every person inside Hartford's chapel sat completely silent, listening to them circle in the matter. Darkness. No one breathed loudly. No one prayed. Even the minister stopped speaking mid-sermon because the sound outside felt too deliberate to ignore. One full pass around the church, then another. Measured footsteps moving beyond the walls, while candlelight trembled softly across frightened faces inside the room. I remember realizing then how deeply fear had rooted itself into Hartford because nobody questioned whether the sounds were real anymore. The town had passed beyond doubt weeks earlier. Now people expected the darkness outside to answer them back. Then the footsteps stopped directly beside the rear church doors. Silence followed for several seconds, and softly, from the other side of the wood, a woman's voice whispered one sentence clearly enough for everyone to hear. "You left us outside." Several people immediately began crying after that. One man stumbled backward hard enough to knock over a candle stand, while others started praying loudly over one another. The minister himself looked pale beneath the lantern glow as he gripped the church podium tightly without speaking. Then the knocking began. 3 slow knocks against the rear church doors. Calm, patient. A woman near the front pew screamed and collapsed to her knees while the sound echoed through the chapel again. 3 more knocks, exactly spaced. I forced myself toward the rear entrance despite every instinct warning me not to, because part of me still desperately needed this to have a human explanation. Maybe townspeople frightening each other. Maybe grief turning into collective panic. But deep down I already knew something worse had happened to Hartford. Fear itself had become alive inside the town. I reached the doors while people shouted behind me not to open them. The knocking stopped the moment my hand touched the wood. Complete silence settled outside again. Slowly, I pulled one side of the church doors inward and raised my lantern toward the darkness beyond. Nobody stood there. The churchyard stretched empty beneath drifting fog, while weak moonlight reflected across gravestones and muddy paths surrounding the building. No footprints appeared near the entrance despite rain-soft ground covering the entire yard. Nothing visible should have been capable of making those footsteps. Then the whispering started again, not outside, inside the church. Soft voices moving through the chapel behind me from different corners of the room, some crying, some praying, some repeating names quietly beneath their breath. I turned immediately toward the congregation and realized the whispers weren't coming from the people themselves, they were moving between them. The atmosphere inside the church changed instantly after that realization. Several people began accusing each other openly in panic. One woman pointed toward another family, claiming she heard their voices outside her home at night. Another man swore someone near the back pew had been whispering beside him during prayers, despite nobody sitting there. The fear spread through the chapel faster than fire because once suspicion starts moving through frightened people, every glance begins looking guilty. And standing there watching Hartford collapse into accusation inside its own church, I finally understood the true horror of the panic. The voices didn't need to attack anyone physically. They only needed to keep people afraid enough to continue turning against one another. Then I heard my own name whispered softly from the empty rear doorway behind me. I turned sharply. No one stood outside. But this time another voice answered immediately from somewhere deeper in the fog-covered churchyard. He hears us clearly now. A cold pressure moved through my chest because I recognized the voices instantly again. Women already executed, men already buried, people Hartford claimed to have cleansed from the town. Then one final whisper drifted through the open church doors from somewhere beyond the graves. Calm, certain. Soon they'll fear you too. The moment the voice said, soon they would fear me too, I understood something horrifying about Hartford that had been growing quietly in front of me the entire time. The town no longer needed evidence to destroy people. Fear itself had become enough. Inside the church, the panic continued spreading between families, while accusations erupted from every direction at once. People who had prayed beside each other for years suddenly stared at neighbors like strangers. Some claimed they heard voices near certain homes at night. Others swore they saw figures standing outside windows before dawn, and every new story immediately became proof for someone else's suspicion. I remember slowly backing away from the congregation while the shouting grew louder because for the first time since the panic began, I realized Hartford could no longer tell the difference between haunting and fear. The two had fused together completely. Then another woman screamed near the front pews and pointed toward the church windows. Everyone turned at once. Figures stood outside in the fog beyond the graveyard. Several of them, motionless silhouettes partially obscured by drifting mist. Men, women, different heights, different clothing, watching the church silently from beyond the graves. No one moved toward the doors after that. The entire congregation remained frozen while the figures outside stood perfectly still in the darkness. I raised my lantern higher, trying to see their faces clearly, But every time the light touched them directly, the fog shifted unnaturally and blurred their outlines again. "Who are they?" someone whispered behind me. Deep down, I think everyone already knew the answer. They looked like the people Hartford had buried. Then the whispers began moving through the church again, soft voices drifting between pews without visible mouths speaking them, calm, overlapping conversations surrounding the congregation from every direction. They still blame us. They need another name. They always will. Some people dropped to their knees praying. Others covered their ears while crying openly, but the voices continued anyway, moving through the church walls, beneath the floorboards, through the spaces between frightened people packed together inside the chapel. And slowly I realized something even worse. The voices weren't angry. They sounded tired. Like Hartford had repeated the same cycle of fear so many times that even the dead expected it to continue. Then suddenly, every whisper stopped at once. Complete silence fell across the church again. A single woman standing near the middle pews slowly turned her head toward me. Her expression looked pale beneath candlelight, eyes wide with terror. "I heard your voice outside my house last night," she whispered. The room went still immediately after she said it. More people began staring toward me. Not everyone, just enough. And in that moment, I finally understood the true nature of the panic. Nobody was safe from it. Not the accused, not the watchman, not even the people trying to stop it. Once fear rooted deeply enough inside Hartford, eventually every person became a possible answer for someone else's terror. I left the town less than 2 days later. I didn't wait for another accusation because by then I could already feel the atmosphere shifting around me. People hesitated before speaking near me. Conversations stopped when I approached. And twice during my final patrol, I noticed footsteps following behind me again through the fog-covered roads near the churchyard. The last thing I heard before leaving Hartford happened shortly before sunrise while packing supplies near the edge of town. I paused because I thought someone whispered my name from the woods nearby. Then another voice answered softly from deeper in the trees. He finally understands. I never returned to Hartford after that, but years later travelers still carried stories from the town. Some claimed voices continued near the churchyard after midnight. Others swore figures appeared outside windows shortly before new accusations spread through nearby settlements. And more than one traveler described hearing whispers repeating private fears back to them from empty roads after dark. Sometimes I still think about Hartford when night becomes too quiet. The locked doors, the fog between homes, the way ordinary people slowly transformed into something unrecognizable under enough fear. And honestly, I still don't know whether the hauntings were ever truly real. But I do know this. Once an entire town begins listening for evil in the darkness every night, eventually someone always hears something answering back. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to True Haunting Log so you never miss the next encounter. And if you've ever lived somewhere where fear changed the way people looked at each other, send your story to truehauntinglog@gmail.com. And tell us in the comments, what other ghost topic do you want to hear real stories about next?